What happens when the man who seems to have everything, the wealth, the empire, the respect of an entire city, chooses to pretend he's weak, vulnerable, even drunk, just to see who will notice? And what happens when the one person who does isn't another powerful executive, but a young secretary struggling to keep her place in a world that constantly underestimates her? This is the story of Richard Hale, a millionaire CEO whose empire stood tall but whose heart was quietly crumbling. And Clara Whitfield, the woman no one expected to matter, yet who would change the course of his life forever. It's a story of whispers in crowded boardrooms, of ruthless rivals determined to destroy them, of choices that could cost careers, reputations, even love itself. But it's also about something deeper, the courage to remain human in a world that rewards masks, the strength to choose loyalty over ambition, and the kind of love that grows not in safety, but in risk. So, let me ask you, if you had to choose between your career and the love of your life, what would you do? Stay with us, like, share, and subscribe, and let's begin this journey. The 37th floor of the Hale Financial Tower shimmered like a glass cathedral against the winter night sky. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently across the city of Chicago, catching the glow of the street lamps. Inside, the annual celebration was in full swing. Waiters in crisp black uniforms floated between clusters of executives, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The hum of conversation was threaded with the soft brass notes of a live jazz quartet. Clara Whitfield pressed her back against a marble column near the far wall, her fingers tightening around the stem of a half-empty glass of sparkling water. She wasn't supposed to be here, at least. Not really. She was a secretary, a temporary one at that, filling in after the last assistant quit without notice. This party wasn't her world. It belonged to the men in tailored suits, the women in glittering gowns, and the power deals being whispered over clinking glasses. Still, she stayed. She had promised herself she would watch carefully, listen more than she spoke, and never forget why she had fought for this chance. Her mother's medical bills were stacked in neat piles on the kitchen counter of their modest apartment. Every extra hour Clara could work, every impression she could make, it all mattered. To her, this job wasn't a stepping stone. It was survival. "Miss Whitfield," a voice called, low and polite. She turned to see Charles Bingham, a senior vice president with salt and pepper hair, offering her a flute of champagne. His smile was polished, the kind executives wore like armor. "Thank you," Clara said softly, "but I'm fine with this." She lifted her glass of water. He lingered a moment too long, his eyes searching hers, before moving back into the sea of black tuxedos. Clara exhaled, relieved. She didn't like champagne anyway. What she did like, what she couldn't stop herself from noticing, was him, Richard Hale, from across the room. Even in a crowd of admirers, he commanded attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair flecked with just enough gray to make him look distinguished rather than old. His suit was flawless, but it wasn't the clothing that made people stare. It was the way he carried himself, unshakable, deliberate, as though every movement was calculated. He was the kind of man who never needed to raise his voice to make the room go silent. Clara had read about him long before she worked here. The self-made millionaire who pulled Hale Financial back from the brink of collapse and turned it into one of the Midwest's most formidable investment firms. But what struck her most tonight wasn't the legend, it was the loneliness. Even surrounded by people, his eyes seemed far away, guarded, as though there were walls no one could breach. She was still watching when it happened. One of his aides pressed a glass of red wine into his hand. Richard raised it in a toast, his smile just a shade too wide. His laugh rolled across the room, louder than usual. Then, as if on cue, he staggered not much, just a small sway, enough to make the group around him chuckle. But Clara didn't laugh. She frowned. His eyes told a different story. They weren't hazy or dulled. They were sharp, almost too sharp, scanning the room even as his body mimicked a stumble. Every movement, the tilt of the glass, the lean against the chair was too precise to be real. He was pretending. Clara's pulse quickened. She couldn't imagine why a man like Richard Hale would feign drunkenness at his own company's celebration. But she knew with certainty that's exactly what he was doing. And if she could see it, someone else surely could too. Her thoughts were interrupted by Mark Preston. His cologne hit her nose before his voice did. Enjoying the show. His tone dripped with amusement. Mark was one of the firm's middle managers, handsome in the way a spoiled trust fund son could be, with a smirk that always made Clara's stomach knot. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, shifting slightly to create distance. Mark leaned closer. "Most temps don't get invited to parties like this. Guess you made an impression?" His eyes flicked toward Richard. Clara stiffened, but before she could respond, a voice cut through the air like a blade of ice. "Mr. Preston," Richard said. He had moved so quietly no one noticed until he was standing beside them. "I believe your wife is looking for you." His words were calm, but the steel in his tone was unmistakable. Mark's smirk faltered. He muttered something and slipped away into the crowd. Clara found herself alone with Richard Hale. Up close, she noticed things she hadn't from across the room. The faint lines etched at the corners of his eyes. The way his jaw tightened and released, as though holding back something he'd never say aloud. His cologne, subtle, cedar and smoke made her dizzy in a way the champagne never could. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes," he replied simply. "I did." His voice was steady, but it wasn't the voice of a man who had been drinking all night. "Are you enjoying the evening, Miss Whitfield?" The fact that he knew her name sent a ripple of shock through her chest. "It's educational," she answered, her voice low, his mouth curved, just slightly. "Educational. I like that." He swayed, catching himself against the wall with a hand, his movements perfectly choreographed. "Perhaps you could help me with a little education of my own." His words slurred just enough to sell the act, but his eyes never wavered from hers. "Would you mind helping me to my car? I'd hate to make a scene." Clara hesitated, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on them. She could say no. She could expose him right here, earn herself a story that would ripple through every corridor of Hale Financial by Monday morning. Or she could choose differently. Her throat was dry as she set her glass down. "Of course," she said. "Let me get your coat." As she slipped his arm over her shoulder and guided him toward the elevators, Clara felt every whisper, every gaze burning into her back. She was no one, a temporary secretary from a working-class family, yet she was the one leading the most powerful man in the company out of the spotlight. The elevator doors closed behind them with a hush. The hum of the machinery filled the silence, heavy with unspoken tension. Clara's heart thudded, unsure whether she was walking into danger, opportunity, or something she couldn't yet name. The party still pulsed behind them as Clara guided Richard toward the elevator. Every step felt like a spotlight on her back. Conversations dimmed as they passed. Then, inevitably, the whispers began again, sharp and slicing. "Did you see that she's leaving with him? Another secretary? Predictable. She won't last a month." Clara kept her eyes forward, jaw tight. She had grown up in a neighborhood where people always found something to talk about: your clothes, your paycheck, your family's struggles. Gossip had a way of making its own gravity. Tonight was no different. The weight of their stares pressed down, but she refused to bow under it. Richard leaned against her shoulder, his arm heavy but steady. His act was convincing too convincing. He swayed just enough to look impaired, but never enough to make her stumble. His composure was unnerving, even in this strange play he was staging. Clara couldn't help but wonder, why put himself in this position? When the elevator doors slid open with a muted chime, the two of them stepped inside. The mirrored walls reflected their awkward closeness back at them. The powerful CEO draped against a junior secretary, her brow furrowed in concentration. Clara pressed the button for the garage, and the doors shut, sealing them into silence. The hum of the elevator motor filled the space. Clara's heart pounded so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. Richard rested his hand against the railing, his body angled toward her. Yet his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, studied the reflections instead of her face. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Richard let out a low chuckle, the kind that sent goosebumps across her arms. "You're not going to ask me why?" His voice was clear, no slur, no drunken haze. Clara's grip on her handbag tightened. She turned to him, their reflections meeting in the glass. "Why you're pretending?" His smile thinned, almost imperceptibly. "You noticed?" The admission hung in the air like a test, waiting for her to stumble over it. Clara took a slow breath. She had two choices: call him out for the charade, or answer honestly. Her instincts told her that honesty was more dangerous, but also the only way forward. "I noticed," she said softly, "because it didn't add up. Your eyes weren't drunk. Your posture wasn't careless. You wanted people to believe something that wasn't true." Richard's gaze finally turned to hers, direct and unflinching. He studied her like a man weighing a stock price, calculating risk and return. Clara's pulse raced, but she didn't look away. "And why?" he asked quietly. "Did you choose not to expose me?" The question carried weight. It wasn't casual curiosity. It was an inquiry into her character. Clara could almost feel the invisible scales tipping between them. Her lips parted, and the words came out more easily than she expected. "Because everyone deserves the right to be human." For the first time, Richard faltered. His features softened, as if the armor slipped for a brief second. A crease formed at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but something gentler than the icy detachment he usually wore. The elevator dinged, breaking the moment. The doors opened to the underground garage, where the dim lighting cast long shadows across the polished cars lined like soldiers. Clara led him toward a sleek black sedan parked near the exit. The driver, a man in a dark suit, quickly stepped forward, but Richard waved him off with a curt gesture. "I'll handle it," Richard said, his tone back to commanding, though his posture was suddenly straighter, steadier. He no longer leaned on Clara. The performance had ended. She stopped a few feet from the car, her hand slipping away from his arm. "So, you're fine after all?" Richard nodded, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face again. More than fine. He adjusted his cufflinks, his movements precise, deliberate. Then he glanced at her, the faint trace of that softened look returning. "You could have made a scene in there. You could have exposed me." Clara folded her arms, the chill of the garage seeping into her bones. What would that have solved? Maybe people would have laughed. Maybe it would have made me look clever. But it wouldn't have changed anything about who you are or what you carry. The words surprised even her. She hadn't planned them. They had come from someplace deeper, a place of empathy she rarely revealed at work. Richard tilted his head, as though trying to read the pages of a book she kept closed. His silence stretched, not heavy, but contemplative. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Most people see what they want to see: power, wealth, weakness, scandal. Very few see the truth. You might be one of the few." Clara didn't know what to say. She shifted her weight, suddenly aware of how close they stood, how strange it was to be here alone in the dim garage with the most powerful man in the company. The driver discreetly looked away, giving them privacy. Richard reached for the car door, but paused, his hand on the handle. "Thank you." "Miss Whitfield," he said quietly, "for tonight." Clara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good night, Mr. Hale." As he slid into the back seat, she caught a final glimpse of his face illuminated by the dashboard light. For the briefest second, the hardness was gone, replaced by something almost vulnerable. Then the door shut, and the car pulled away into the Chicago night. Clara stood alone in the cold garage, her breath visible in the air. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but she knew one thing. Something between them had shifted, not in a way she could define, not yet, but enough that she felt it settle deep in her chest, like the first crack in a wall that had always seemed unbreakable. Monday mornings had always carried a kind of weight, but this one felt different the moment Clara pushed through the revolving glass doors of Hale & Co. The lobby gleamed with polished marble and tall chrome pillars, but beneath the sheen, Clara sensed something sharp in the air. It wasn't just the usual buzz of emails and early coffee. It was something heavier anticipation mixed with judgment. Her heels clicked against the floor as she crossed the atrium toward the security gates. Every step echoed louder than it should have. She swiped her badge, trying to appear calm, but the hush that spread across the lobby told her all she needed to know. The whispers had begun. Two interns she barely knew stood near the cafe kiosk, leaning close to each other. Their voices were low, but Clara had always had an ear for tones, the way people's mouths curled when they thought they were clever. She went home with him. I heard. No surprise. That's how people move up around here. Clara stiffened, resisting the urge to turn and confront them. She told herself it didn't matter. Let them gossip, let them invent. But as she stepped into the elevator, her throat burned with unsaid words. On the 38th floor, where the glass-walled offices of middle managers lined the corridor, the atmosphere was worse. Conversations stopped when she walked past. Heads turned too quickly, pretending to focus on screens. A woman she often shared lunch with offered a smile, but it was the brittle kind, polite, distant, already withdrawing. Clara settled into her cubicle, tucked between a filing cabinet and a view of the city she rarely had time to enjoy. She powered on her computer, the familiar hum of the system starting up a small comfort against the storm gathering around her. But then she overheard it again. Closer this time. Don't act so shocked. She's just another secretary with ambition. Imagine catching his eye at the party. Perfect timing, right? Clara gripped her coffee mug until her knuckles turned white. The heat didn't burn as much as their words. It wasn't long before Mark Preston appeared, his presence like a cold draft through an open window. He was everything Clara wasn't: tall, polished, born into money, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to wonder if the rent would clear. His father had been a partner in a Chicago law firm. Mark wore that privilege like a second suit. Well, he drawled, leaning against her cubicle wall as though it were his personal podium. His smile was sharp, his cologne expensive enough to sting her nose. Quite the weekend for you, Whitfield. Clara kept her eyes on her screen. Good morning, Mark. Oh, don't be shy, he said. Half the office saw you escorting Mr. Hale out Friday night. Quite the honor. He paused, letting the implication hang like smoke. Or, should I say, opportunity. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Every part of her wanted to fire back, to cut through his arrogance with words that would leave a scar. But another part of her, the part that had spent years carefully building her place in this company, told her to stay silent. You know, Mark continued, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret, people talk. They'll say you're climbing the ladder the old-fashioned way. And who could blame you? Some of us work for years to get noticed. You just had to notice him. Clara's chest tightened. She turned, finally meeting his gaze. His eyes were pale, unfeeling, like ice on a winter lake. Careful. Mark, she said quietly. Rumors have a way of circling back. His smile widened, as if her resistance amused him. Relax. I'm just giving you advice. This building eats people alive when they forget their place. And trust me, Clara, you don't want to end up on the wrong side of a story you can't control. With that, he pushed off her cubicle wall and strolled away, leaving the scent of his cologne and the sting of his words behind him. The rest of the day blurred. Clara answered phones, scheduled meetings, and organized files, her body moving through the motions while her mind wrestled with the whispers. She had always prided herself on professionalism, on being invisible in the best way, efficient, reliable, unremarkable. Now, invisibility was gone. She felt the separation in small moments. A colleague who once invited her for coffee now avoided eye contact. An analyst she'd helped last week brushed past without acknowledgement. The unspoken verdict was clear. Clara Whitfield was no longer one of them. She was something else, something suspect. At lunch, she sat alone in the cafeteria, the smell of reheated soup wafting around her. She could feel eyes tracking her movements, subtle but sharp. She stirred her spoon aimlessly, appetite gone. Do I fight back? She wondered. Do I confront the lies, speak the truth, expose what really happened in that garage? Or do I keep my head down, let the storm pass, and protect what little footing I have here? Both options carried weight. Silence might preserve her job, but cost her dignity. Speaking out might restore her dignity, but risk everything else. Her phone buzzed with a new email. She opened it, hoping for a distraction. Instead, the subject line made her stomach drop. Weekend behavior, concerns. It was from Human Resources. By the time she returned to her desk, her hands were trembling. She tried to type, to bury herself in the safety of spreadsheets, but the words blurred. The office felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in, the fluorescent lights harsh against her skin. For the first time since joining Hale & Co., Clara felt like an intruder in her own workplace. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Clara had just returned from lunch when the phone on her desk rang, its shrill tone startling her. She answered automatically, her voice steady despite the gnawing unease in her stomach. "This is Clara Whitfield. Miss Whitfield." A crisp female voice replied, cool and precise. "This is Vivian Stone, Mr. Hale's executive secretary. He would like to see you in his office. Now." The line went dead before Clara could respond. Her pulse quickened. No one was invited to the top floor. You were summoned. The elevator ride felt endless. As the numbers climbed, Clara smoothed her skirt and straightened her shoulders, rehearsing neutrality. Her reflection in the mirrored doors looked composed, but her heart hammered like it wanted out of her chest. When the doors opened, she stepped into a different world. The executive floor was quiet in a way that wasn't peace, but command soft carpets that swallowed footsteps. Walls lined with modern art, chosen more for investment than beauty, and floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed Chicago's skyline as if the city itself were an ornament. Vivian Stone was waiting, immaculate in a burgundy suit, dark hair pulled back into a perfect knot. Vivian radiated authority. Her expression was professional, but her eyes held the faint gleam of someone measuring Clara against a checklist. "Follow me," she said, her heels clicking with military precision across the marble. They stopped at a pair of heavy oak doors embossed with Richard Hale's name in discreet brass letters. Vivian knocked once, opened the door, and gestured for Clara to enter. "Miss Whitfield, as requested." Clara stepped inside. The office was more like a private cathedral to power. A massive desk of polished walnut dominated the space. Its surface perfectly ordered, no stray paper clips, no forgotten files. Behind it, tall glass windows revealed the expanse of Lake Michigan, sunlight glittering on the water. To the side, leather chairs formed a seating area arranged with geometric precision. Everything spoke of control, of wealth, of unshakable authority. Richard Hale sat behind the desk, reading a document. The daylight revealed a different version of him, sharper, more formidable than the man she'd escorted Friday night. The faint vulnerability she had glimpsed in the parking garage was gone. His steel gray suit was pressed without a crease, his dark hair precisely styled, his posture one of command. "Close the door. Miss Stone," Richard said, without looking up. The door clicked shut. Silence filled the room. Finally, he raised his eyes to Clara. "Sit." She obeyed, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. For a long moment, Richard studied her. His fingers formed a steeple beneath his chin, his gaze cool, unreadable. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. "I assume," Clara replied carefully. "It's about Friday night." "Indeed." He stood, moving to the windows. His voice shifted, less sharp, more contemplative. "In 18 years of business, I've learned to read people quickly. It's a survival skill in this world. And yet," he turned, his eyes fixed on hers. "You intrigue me." Clara's breath caught, but she held his gaze. "Friday night," Richard continued. "I gave you an opportunity. You could have gained leverage over me, a story, an advantage, a shortcut, but you didn't take it. Why, the question was one she had dreaded since that night in the garage. Still, she answered with the truth. Because power without humanity is cruelty, she said softly. And you didn't seem cruel. For the first time, something flickered across Richard's face, surprise, maybe even respect. Most people in your position, he said, moving closer, would have taken what they could. You're not most people. The silence that followed felt charged, as if the room itself held its breath. Then Richard leaned against the edge of his desk, his gaze intent. I need someone I can trust, someone who sees past the title, the reputation, the money, someone who would help a stranger in a parking garage without expecting reward. Clara's brow furrowed. What are you asking? He straightened, his words deliberate. Vivian is being promoted to Director of Executive Operations. That leaves a vacancy. I want you to be my personal assistant. Clara blinked. The words hit her like a physical blow. Personal assistant to Richard Hale. It was more than a promotion. It was an invitation into the inner sanctum of power. But beneath the shock was fear. She knew what people already whispered about her, the poison of rumor spreading like wildfire. Accepting this role would feed those whispers until they burned her whole reputation to ash. She tried to steady her voice. Why me? You could have anyone, someone with experience, connections, a degree from Harvard or Wharton. What do you really want from me? For a moment, Richard's mask slipped. She saw something raw in his expression, almost vulnerable. Because I'm tired of people who want something from me, he said quietly. You helped me without expecting anything. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Clara's throat tightened. And if I disappoint you, she asked, then you'll join a very long list, Richard said, his tone shifting back to controlled. But I don't think you will. She looked down at her folded hands. This was more than a job offer. It was a crossroad. To say yes meant stepping into a world where every move would be scrutinized, where power and peril were intertwined. To say no meant safety of a sort, but also the loss of an opportunity she might never see again. Richard's gaze didn't waver. The offer is on the table. But understand this. Miss Whitfield Trust is not something I extend twice. The air in the office felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Clara's heart raced. She had always prided herself on discipline, on staying the course. But now, she stood on the edge of something vast, dangerous, and possibly life-changing. Was this the door to her future or the edge of a cliff? The move happened faster than Clara could process. One day she was tucked away in a corner cubicle, half forgotten in the intern bullpen. The next, she was unpacking a small box of belongings into an office on the 42nd floor, just steps away from Richard Hale's private suite. Her new office was modest by comparison, but compared to what she'd known, it felt surreal. A mahogany desk gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the Chicago River, sunlight glittering on its restless current. The carpet was thick, the chair leather-bound, the phone system far more advanced than anything she'd handled before. Everything seemed designed to remind her you are now in the inner circle. Yet, with the view came pressure. Her first assignment was deceptively simple: organize Richard's calendar. What she discovered was less like scheduling and more like navigating a battlefield. Meetings stacked with no breaks, conference calls scheduled across time zones, travel plans that defied the laws of sleep. It was as if his life had been reduced to a puzzle only the most disciplined could solve. By mid-morning, Clara's fingers ached from typing, her eyes blurred from flipping between schedules. She had already rescheduled a call with Hong Kong twice, shifted a quarterly review to accommodate a last-minute investor, and fielded 3 separate urgent requests from vice presidents who each believed their needs outweighed everyone else's. The phone rang again. Hale & Co. Executive office? This is Clara. Finally, a voice crackled over the line. British, sharp, amused. This is Andrew Collins. Richard promised me 10 minutes this morning, and I intend to collect Kindly patch me through before I start sending ravens. Despite her exhaustion, Clara smiled faintly. One moment. Mr. Collins. She transferred the call, only to be interrupted by Richard himself stepping out of his office. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, but his expression was a storm contained. Cancel the investor lunch, move the quarterly report to Thursday, and tell Collins I'll call him back after 6. Yes, sir, Clara said quickly, scribbling notes. He was gone before she could ask for clarification, his door closing with the soft but decisive finality of command. By noon, Clara felt like she had run a marathon without leaving her chair. She had learned more about Richard's world in a few hours than she had in months at the company. Every minute mattered. Every second was accounted for. There was no room for error. Vivian Stone arrived just as Clara was considering skipping lunch. The newly promoted director of executive operations looked every bit the part-tailored suit, polished demeanor, presence that filled the doorway. She carried a leather portfolio and the faint air of someone both congratulatory and cautionary. Settling in, Vivian asked. Clara nodded, trying to... Vivian set the portfolio on Clara's desk. These are Richard's personal preferences: travel, diet, contacts. Memorize them. He values efficiency. Clara opened the portfolio and nearly gasped. It was meticulous lists of acceptable airlines, dietary notes, names of people who should never be put through under any circumstances. Even his brand of coffee was specified, along with how many minutes he preferred to spend on certain types of calls. It's a lot, Clara admitted. Vivian's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It's a world few get to see. But let me give you one piece of advice. Miss Whitfield. She leaned in slightly, her voice firm. Richard values loyalty above ambition. Don't disappoint him. The words lingered long after Vivian left. Clara sat staring at the portfolio, her chest tightening. Loyalty above ambition. Was that a warning or a promise? The rest of the afternoon blurred into a frenzy of calls, emails, and meetings. Clara escorted Richard to a conference with 3 senior partners, each of whom treated her as though she were invisible until she quietly corrected a scheduling mistake that saved them from embarrassment. Later, she watched him deliver sharp, precise orders during a negotiation call, his voice commanding but calm. Yet, even in the polished veneer of the executive floor, Clara began to sense cracks. In the corridor, she overheard 2 vice presidents arguing in hushed but heated tones about resource allocation. In the break room, an assistant whispered about an upcoming board meeting, her eyes darting to be sure no one overheard. In Richard's absence, people's smiles thinned, their words carried barbs. Power, Clara realized, wasn't just about wealth, it was about proximity, influence, the ability to tilt decisions in your favor. And here, at the top floor, power wasn't shared, it was fought over. As the sun dipped low, painting the river gold, Clara leaned back in her chair, exhausted but restless. She thought of her colleagues on the lower floors, the gossip still circulating like wildfire. Up here, the whispers were different, but just as dangerous. She stared at Richard's closed office door. He had offered her trust, but it felt less like a gift and more like a contract. Every action she took from now on would be measured against that one principle: loyalty. And loyalty, Clara knew, had a price. The week had barely begun, yet Clara already felt as though she had been put through a grinder. Richard's calendar was relentless back-to-back strategy meetings, investor calls, and an upcoming trip that required juggling 4 time zones at once. Her desk was a flurry of papers, sticky notes, and glowing reminders on her screen. She was in the middle of coordinating a late afternoon conference call with London when a shadow fell across her desk. Busy. Whitfield. The voice carried a smug familiarity that made her shoulders stiffen. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Mark Preston leaned casually against the edge of her desk. His tie loosened just enough to look effortless, his grin sharp as ever. "I have to say, you've adjusted quickly. Must be nice, skipping the line. Clara kept her gaze on her monitor. I'm doing my job. Mark, is there something you need? He laughed, though the sound was hollow. No, just curious. Most people spend years clawing their way up before they even get a glimpse of this floor. You one weekend with Mr. Hale and poof, you're suddenly indispensable. Clara's jaw tightened. She typed a note to herself, forcing her fingers not to tremble. If you have business with Mr. Hale, you can schedule through me. Oh, I'll be sure to, Mark said, leaning closer. Though I wonder if I should bring roses next time. That seems to be the fast track. The words hit like a slap. Clara finally looked up, her eyes flashing. Watch yourself. Or what? Mark tilted his head, his voice dropping. Going to run and tell your boss I'm sure he'd love to swoop in again. Must be comforting, having a man like that ready to clean up your messes. Clara opened her mouth, but another voice cut through the room, quiet, sharp, undeniable. That's enough. Both of them froze. Richard Hale stood in the doorway of his office, his expression carved from stone. His presence filled the air like a storm rolling in, the kind that made people scatter before the first crack of thunder. Mark straightened, his smirk faltering. Mr. Hale, I was just leaving. Richard interrupted. His tone was even, but the finality in it left no room for debate. Mark's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since Clara had known him, he looked unsettled. He glanced at Clara, his glare promising retaliation, before retreating down the hall. The silence he left behind was deafening. Richard's gaze lingered on Clara for a moment, softer now, but still waited. If he bothers you again, you tell me. Clara swallowed hard, her pulse racing. I can handle myself. I don't doubt that, Richard replied, his voice low. But no one undermines my staff. Not while I'm here. He disappeared back into his office, the door closing firmly behind him. Clara sat frozen, her hands pressed flat against the desk. The heat in her chest was part gratitude, part dread. Gratitude for the shield Richard had thrown around her. Dread for the attention it would draw. She could already hear the whispers forming in the hall. They wouldn't see his defense as professionalism. They would twist it, weaponize it, turn it into another story to feed the office rumor mill. Her thoughts spiraled. What happens the next time Mark tries something, or the next will Richard step in again? And if he does, will they start to believe I can't stand on my own? She thought of Vivian's words. Richard values loyalty above ambition. Don't disappoint him. Did loyalty mean leaning on him, or proving she didn't need him to protect her? Clara pushed her chair back, standing to steady herself. Her reflection in the window caught her eye, the skyline sprawling behind her, Chicago stretching out in steel and glass. From here, the city looked conquerable, but inside these walls, Clara felt small, caught between gratitude and fear. She wanted to believe Richard's defense had been for fairness, not favoritism, but the line between the two was blurring, and she could already feel the consequences closing in. The rest of the day dragged beneath the weight of what had happened. Passing colleagues glanced at her with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. A pair of assistants whispered in the break room, their eyes darting toward her before they quickly looked away. Even Vivian stopped by, her expression unreadable. I heard there was a disagreement, she said carefully. It's resolved, Clara replied, forcing her tone to remain calm. Vivian studied her for a long moment before nodding. Once, be careful, Clara. The higher you rise, the sharper the knives become. When Vivian left, Clara sank back into her chair, exhausted. That night, as she packed her things to leave, Clara paused by Richard's office door. She could see the glow of his desk lamp through the frosted glass. For a fleeting moment, she considered knocking, thanking him, but something inside her stopped her hand. Instead, she walked away, heels clicking softly against the carpet, her thoughts a whirl of contradictions. She was grateful. She was unsettled. She was afraid of what this protection would cost her. And beneath it all, She couldn't shake the feeling that the first clash was only the beginning. The office was unusually quiet that night. Most of the staff had gone home hours earlier, but Clara was still at her desk, finishing notes from Richard's last call. The city glowed beyond the windows, streetlights shimmering on wet pavement, headlights threading through the veins of Chicago like restless fireflies. She rubbed her temples, stifling a yawn. Her clock read nearly 9:15 She should have left an hour ago. But the truth was, she had grown used to staying late. The work was overwhelming, yes, but it also kept her from thinking too much about the whispers, about Mark's smirk, about how fragile her position here felt. The door to Richard's office opened, and she looked up. He stood there, jacket off, tie loosened, the first two buttons of his shirt undone. It was the most unguarded she had ever seen him inside these walls. "Still here?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Clara gave a small smile. "Someone has to keep your empire running." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I appreciate that, but you shouldn't burn yourself out. Not for me." She hesitated, unsure how to respond. He seemed different tonight, less like the immovable CEO and more like a man worn down by his own legend. Richard glanced at his watch, then back at her. "Have you eaten?" Clara blinked. "No, not yet." He studied her for a moment, then said, "Join me for dinner. Just dinner. No business." The words lingered in the air. Clara's pulse jumped. Dinner? With Richard Hale? Her mind raced. Every instinct screamed caution. A late-night dinner with her boss could feed the gossip mill for weeks. People already believed she was climbing on his shadow. This would only confirm it. But another part of her, quieter, deeper, longed to say yes. She wanted to know the man behind the impenetrable armor, to understand the loneliness she'd glimpsed that night in the garage. Her throat tightened. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said carefully. Richard tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You're afraid of what they'll say." Clara didn't answer. He was right. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Let them say what they want. This isn't about them. It's about dinner. About two people who have worked themselves half to death and need a meal." Clara searched his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a man playing a game. They were weary, sincere, almost pleading. Against her better judgment, she heard herself whisper, "All right." They chose a quiet Italian restaurant on the north side, tucked away from the usual corporate haunts. The lights were low, the walls lined with shelves of old wine bottles, the air warm with garlic and baked bread. A place for ordinary people, not CEOs and their assistants. The host recognized Richard immediately, but to Clara's surprise, he said nothing. He simply led them to a secluded booth in the corner, where candlelight softened the hard edges of Richard's face. They ordered simply pasta for her, grilled salmon for him, a bottle of red wine between them. For a while, they ate in silence, the clink of cutlery and the murmur of other diners filling the gaps. Finally, Richard set down his fork. "Do you know what people see when they look at me, Clara?" She shook her head. "A machine," he said flatly. "A man who wakes, works, and wins. Nothing more. To the board, I'm quarterly returns. To investors, I'm a guarantee. To competitors, I'm a threat. No one ever asks if I'm tired." The rawness in his voice startled her. "Are you?" she asked softly. His eyes met hers. For once, there was no barrier, no calculation, just truth, every day. The candlelight flickered between them. Clara's chest tightened. She had spent years caring for her mother, working 2 jobs, pushing herself to exhaustion. She knew what it was to be tired, but she had never imagined someone like Richard Hale, the man who seemed untouchable, could feel the same. "Doesn't anyone close to you notice?" she asked. He gave a hollow laugh. "Close. You assume I let anyone close. It's easier not to. No one can betray what they don't know." Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. His words were heavy, tinged with bitterness. She thought of all the headlines she had read about him, power deals, rivalries, acquisitions. Never once had they mentioned the solitude of the man behind them. "You don't have to be a machine, you know," she said gently. "You're allowed to be human." For a moment, silence hung between them, thick and fragile. Richard leaned back, studying her as though trying to memorize every line of her face. "Do you believe that he asked?" "I do," Clara whispered. The space between them felt smaller now, the air charged with something unspoken. It wasn't romance, not yet, it was recognition, the fragile thread of understanding between two people who rarely allowed themselves to be seen. When the check came, Richard waved it away with casual authority, but his eyes stayed on her, softer than she had ever seen them. As they walked out into the cool night, the city lights spilling across the river, Clara felt a strange warmth settle inside her. For the first time, Richard Hale hadn't seemed like the cold, distant CEO. He had seemed like a man, a lonely one, and against all her careful instincts. She wanted to see him that way again. The morning after dinner with Richard, Clara arrived at the office earlier than usual, clutching a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold by the time she reached her desk. She hadn't slept much. Her mind kept circling back to the night before the candlelight, the way Richard had spoken of his loneliness, the surprising gentleness in his eyes. It had been more than dinner. It had been a glimpse into something raw, something that felt almost forbidden. She tried to focus on work. Her inbox was overflowing. Richard's schedule demanded near-constant juggling, and her desk phone hadn't stopped ringing since 8:30. Routine, she told herself. Get lost in the routine, and the memory of last night will quiet down. But then her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. She frowned, setting aside her pen to pick it up. The screen displayed a single image. Her breath caught. It was a photo of her and Richard at dinner. The angle was grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable, the two of them in the corner booth, a bottle of wine between them, candlelight flickering across their faces. Clara's head was tilted slightly toward him, her expression intent. Anyone who saw it would draw the same conclusion. Her hands trembled as she scrolled down. A message followed. HR will hear about this. Clara's stomach dropped. She looked around the office, suddenly hyper-aware of every movement. Across the hall, a junior analyst whispered to another. Two assistants passed by, carrying folders, their eyes flicking toward her. The overhead lights felt harsher than usual, the walls closing in. Someone was watching her, not just casually, but deliberately, waiting for the right moment to strike. She locked her phone, pressing it face down on the desk. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Who took the photo? How long had they been following? How many more pictures were out there by late morning? Richard called her into his office to prepare for a meeting with European investors. She carried her notepad inside, her hands still shaking, though she tried to hide it. He looked up immediately, his sharp eyes narrowing. What's wrong? Clara hesitated. Her instinct told her to keep quiet, not to burden him. But then she remembered the text, the threat hanging over her like a blade. Slowly. She slid the phone across his desk. The screen unlocked to reveal the photo and the message. Richard's jaw tightened as he studied it. His silence was more terrifying than anger. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured, and dangerous. Who sent this, I don't know, Clara whispered. It came from an unlisted number. I don't even know how they got the picture. It feels like someone's following us. Richard's eyes darkened, the muscles in his jaw working as though he were holding back an explosion. He leaned back in his chair, the phone still in his hand, staring at the photo as though he could burn it to ash by will alone. This is Mark, he said flatly. It has to be. Clara swallowed. You don't know that. I don't need proof to know his style. Richard's voice sharpened, cowardice cloaked in strategy. He wouldn't dare face me directly, so he does this. Tries to weaponize whispers. Clara's throat tightened. If HR sees this, they'll believe the worst. He looked up, his gaze cutting straight through her. Do you believe the worst? Her breath caught. No. For the first time that day, something softened in his eyes. He set the phone down carefully, almost reverently, before standing and moving to the window. His silhouette was outlined against the skyline, broad shoulders tense. "If they want to drag you through the mud," he said quietly, "they'll have to go through me first." He turned, his expression hard as steel. "If they want a war, they'll get one." The words should have comforted her, but instead, Clara felt her stomach twist. A war with Mark or anyone really meant exposure, scandal, consequences she wasn't sure either of them could contain. She folded her arms, trying to steady herself. "Richard, if you fight this openly, it will only feed their story. Don't you see? They want you angry. They want you to act like you're protecting me for personal reasons." He stepped closer, his voice low, unwavering. "And what would you have me do? Pretend nothing happened. Let them circle like vultures, waiting for the chance to tear you apart." Clara met his eyes, her voice trembling but firm. "I'd have you choose strategy over pride. You don't need to fight every battle head on. Sometimes you win by refusing to play." The room fell into silence. Richard's eyes searched hers, not with anger now, but with something deeper respect, maybe even admiration. He exhaled, a slow release of tension, before returning to his desk. "You're right," he said finally. "But if they come for you again, I won't stand by." Clara nodded, though her heart still raced. She wanted to believe his words would shield her, but another part of her knew protection could be as dangerous as neglect. Every act of defense would be twisted into evidence, every word of loyalty turned into suspicion. She picked up her notepad, ready to brief him on the investors, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the message. Someone out there had eyes on them, someone who wanted her gone. And for the first time since stepping into Richard's world, Clara wondered if she had underestimated the cost of standing so close to power. The email came at 2:17 p.m. A sterile subject line that sent Clara's stomach into freefall. "Please report to Human Resources at 3:00 p.m. Margaret Doyle." Her hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen. She read the words 3 times, as though repetition might change their meaning. It didn't. Around her, the office hummed with its usual rhythm, phones ringing, printers whirring, muted conversations drifting through the glass partitions, but to Clara it all sounded distant, muffled, like she was underwater. The anonymous text, the photograph, "HR will hear about this." And now, here it was. She gathered her notepad and tucked her phone into her bag, trying to appear calm as she made her way to the elevator. Each step felt heavy, her pulse a steady drum in her ears. The Human Resources Department was on the 12th floor, far from the glass and marble world of the executives. The carpet was beige, the lighting flat, the walls lined with posters about workplace ethics and diversity initiatives. But beneath the corporate polish lay something colder, the unspoken truth that HR wasn't there to protect employees. It was there to protect the company. Margaret Doyle's office was at the end of the hall, door closed, blinds half drawn. Clara knocked softly. "Come in," a voice answered, crisp and controlled. Margaret Doyle sat behind a large desk, papers neatly stacked, a muted digital clock ticking quietly beside her computer. She was a woman in her early 50s, with iron gray hair pulled into a precise bun and eyes that missed nothing. She didn't stand to greet Clara, didn't smile. She merely gestured to the chair opposite her. "Ms. Whitfield," she began, folding her hands on the desk. "Thank you for coming." Clara sat, smoothing her skirt, forcing her hands to stay still in her lap. "Of course." Margaret adjusted her glasses and glanced at a folder in front of her. "I'll be direct. Concerns have been raised about your interactions with Mr. Hale." Clara's heart lurched. Concerns? Yes. Margaret's tone was neutral, clinical, as if she were reading from a manual. Photographs, observations, indications of a personal relationship that could compromise the company's integrity. You are aware, I assume, that our policy regarding relationships between supervisors and subordinates is zero tolerance. Clara swallowed, her throat dry. There is no relationship. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then she leaned back slightly. Whether there is or isn't perception can be just as damaging as reality. In these matters, appearances matter. Clara wanted to protest, to shout that she was being watched, targeted, that she hadn't asked for any of this. But Margaret's eyes were cool, unwavering, the eyes of someone who'd already decided what the story was. "I'm doing my job," Clara said softly. "Nothing more." "Then let me be clear," Margaret replied. "You must maintain appropriate professional boundaries at all times. No private dinners, no extended closed-door meetings, no gestures or conversations that could be misinterpreted." "Do you understand?" Clara nodded, though every fiber of her being wanted to push back. "Good." Margaret closed the folder with a precise snap. "This is not a formal disciplinary action. Consider it a warning. But if any further concerns are raised, we will have no choice but to act. Your career here depends on your discretion." When Clara left the office, the beige hallway felt colder, the walls narrower. She pressed the elevator button, her reflection staring back at her from the metallic doors. Her face looked pale, drawn, zero tolerance. The phrase echoed in her head as she rode down to her floor. Zero tolerance for what? For being seen, for being human. For the flicker of connection she couldn't quite deny. By the time she returned to her desk, the building's rhythm had shifted. People seemed to watch her more openly now. A whispered laugh here, a glance quickly averted there. The air itself felt heavy with suspicion. She lowered herself into her chair and opened her laptop, but the words on the screen blurred. Her fingers hovered uselessly over the keys. Her mind replayed Margaret's voice. "Your career here depends on your discretion." But discretion felt like silence, like complicity, like erasing herself to fit the mold of what everyone else believed she should be. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Clara stayed at her desk long after most had left. The office grew quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space. She pressed her hands over her eyes, exhausted. Am I sacrificing my career for something that may not even be real? The question burned in her chest. She wanted to believe Richard's words from the night before, his confession of loneliness, his insistence that he saw her differently from everyone else. But what if she was wrong? What if it was just another illusion, another man of power weaving his charm to draw her in? If she lost this job, she had nothing else lined up. Rent, bills, her mother's medications all depended on the paycheck she received from this company. And yet, if she chose safety over truth, wasn't she losing something just as important? Her identity, her integrity? The weight of the choice pressed on her, suffocating. She closed her laptop, the screen's glow vanishing into darkness. For the first time since joining the company, Clara felt less like an employee and more like a pawn in someone else's game. Clara sat alone in her apartment that night, the city pressing in on her from every direction. Neon signs flickered against the rain-streaked window. Somewhere below, a cab honked, followed by the muffled thrum of tires on wet pavement. But none of it could drown out the echo of Margaret Doyle's voice in her head. Zero tolerance. The phrase clung to her like a shroud. Her career, her reputation, her entire future at the company, it all balanced on a knife's edge. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to steady the gnawing ache in her chest. Was she really willing to gamble everything on something so fragile, so uncertain? The memory of Richard at dinner, his voice low, almost tender, flashed in her mind. But tenderness didn't pay the bills. Tenderness wouldn't protect her once HR decided she was expendable. If I walked away now, she thought, he'd be safe. His empire would remain intact. I'd be the casualty, not him. And yet, the thought of leaving felt unbearable, like cutting out a piece of herself. The next morning, Clara arrived at the office earlier than usual, determined to bury herself in work. She kept her head down, her words clipped, her eyes fixed on the endless tide of emails and scheduling demands. But Richard noticed. He always noticed. By mid-afternoon, he appeared in her doorway, his expression unreadable. Clara, my office, now. She followed him, her heartbeat quickening. His office was as immaculate as ever, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond. But inside, the air felt heavy, charged. Richard closed the door behind her, then turned, his eyes fixed on her. What happened yesterday? Clara hesitated. HR called me in. His jaw tightened. Margaret, she warned me, Clara said softly. Zero tolerance. She said my career depends on discretion. Richard's eyes darkened. This is exactly what I feared. You don't understand, Clara whispered, the words spilling out. They're not just warning me. They're watching us. Every glance, every conversation, it's all fuel for their story. Richard moved closer, his presence overwhelming, his voice low but steady. Then let them watch. Clara blinked. What I'm not going to pretend, Clara, I won't erase what's between us just because it makes them uncomfortable. His words were like steel wrapped in velvet. I've spent half my life protecting this company, building walls so high no one could touch me, but I'm done living like that. Her chest tightened. Richard, if this continues, it won't just be whispers. They'll come after me. And if they think you're protecting me, they'll come after you too. Are you really willing to risk all of it? Yes. The word landed between them like a hammer. Because I already made my choice. Clara shook her head, her voice trembling. You can't say that. You don't get to make this about me. His eyes softened, though his stance remained unyielding. Clara, I know what I'm saying. I've chosen you, whether or not you believe it yet. Her breath caught. There it was, the truth hovering so close. Almost spoken, but not quite named. Silence stretched between them, thick with everything unsaid. Clara turned toward the window, trying to catch her breath, her reflection pale against the city skyline. I don't know if I can carry this, she admitted quietly. The pressure, the judgment. Every time I walk through those halls, it feels like the walls are closing in. Richard stepped closer, his reflection merging with hers in the glass. You're stronger than you think. She closed her eyes. And what if I'm not? Then I'll be strong enough for both of us. The words broke something inside her. She turned, meeting his gaze, searching for cracks in his certainty. But all she found was conviction, and beneath it, something she hadn't expected. Vulnerability. She wanted to believe him, wanted to fall into the safety he promised. But safety built on defiance was a fragile thing. Richard, her voice faltered. If we admit what this is, if we cross that line, there's no going back. He didn't flinch, I know. And if we lose everything, then we lose it together. For a moment, the world seemed to still. The hum of the city outside faded, the tick of the clock on his desk silenced. It was just the two of them, standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous. Clara felt her pulse racing, her breath shallow. She wanted to close the distance, to surrender to the gravity pulling them closer. But fear held her back, the fear of consequences, of becoming nothing more than a headline in someone else's scandal. Richard seemed to sense her hesitation. His hand twitched, as though he wanted to reach for her, but stopped himself. Instead, his voice softened. We don't have to name it, he said. Not yet. But don't ask me to deny it. Her eyes stung, tears threatening. She nodded once, unable to speak. The unspoken truth hung between them like a fragile thread, undeniable, unbreakable, but not yet confessed. That night, as Clara rode the subway home, she stared out the window at the blur of tunnels rushing past. Her reflection looked back at her, tired, yet haunted, but alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. She pressed her hand against the cool glass. Am I sacrificing my career for something that may not even be real? The question still lingered, sharp as ever, but beneath it was another truth, harder to ignore, real or not. I can't walk away anymore. The break room was nearly empty, save for the low hum of a vending machine and the faint aroma of burnt coffee. Clara had slipped in to catch her breath after a morning of back-to-back scheduling chaos, her nerves frayed from too many late nights and the unrelenting weight of scrutiny. She poured herself a cup, hoping the bitter liquid would steady her hands. That was when she heard the voice, smooth, mocking. Well, if it isn't the queen of the 42nd floor. Clara stiffened before turning. Mark Preston leaned casually against the counter, his suit immaculate, his smirk sharp as glass. He didn't bother hiding the disdain in his eyes. "Mark," Clara said evenly, gripping the paper cup a little too tightly. "Do you need something?" He gave a short laugh. "Need? No. I just thought I'd check in on how the view looks from your new perch. Must be nice. Moving from a corner cubicle to the CEO's right hand overnight." Clara's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression steady. "I was offered the position. I took it. That's all." "Offered?" Mark repeated, drawing out the word as though savoring it. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Don't kid yourself. We both know why you're here. You're nothing but a secretary who thought she could play in the big leagues. And for a moment, they actually let you." The words cut deep, but Clara didn't flinch. She set her coffee down, squared her shoulders, and met his gaze head on. "No, Mark, what you can't stand is that I earned my place here. You think my worth is tied to someone else's power? Because deep down, you're terrified of being average." His smirk faltered, just for an instant. "You had every advantage," Clara pressed, her voice steady now. "Money, connections, the right schools. And still, when you look at yourself in the mirror, all you see is mediocrity. That's why you come after me. Because if someone like me without your pedigree can stand where I stand, then what excuse do you have for failing?" Mark's jaw tightened. His mask of amusement slipped, revealing something harsher beneath anger. Yes, but also fear. "You don't know who you're talking to," he snapped. "Oh, I do," Clara shot back. "A man so desperate to matter that he tries to tear down anyone who reminds him he doesn't." The door swung open behind them. Richard Hale stepped inside. His presence filled the room instantly, the air tightening around him. He didn't say a word at first, just stood in the doorway, eyes fixed on Mark. The silence was suffocating. Mark cleared his throat, straightening his tie as if to reclaim composure. "Mr. Hale, we were just... save it." Richard cut him off, his voice cold as ice. "I heard enough." Clara's chest constricted. Richard's fury wasn't loud. It was quiet, deliberate, the kind that promised consequences. "You will not," Richard continued, his gaze locked on Mark, "speak to her that way again." Mark tried to recover, his smirk returning like a mask hastily reapplied. "With respect, sir, I was only pointing out what everyone's already thinking. There's chatter in every corner of this company. You can't silence it." Richard stepped forward, closing the distance between them until they stood eye to eye. Though Richard's voice stayed measured, the weight of it pressed like a blade against the air. "You mistake my restraint for weakness," he said. "But let me be clear if you undermine her again. If you so much as breathe another insult in her direction, you won't have to worry about chatter. You'll be too busy updating your resume." Mark's smirk faltered once more, but this time it didn't return. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes flicking briefly toward Clara before he muttered, "Understood." "Good," Richard said sharply. "Now leave." For a moment. Mark looked as though he might argue, but one glance at Richard's unflinching stare told him otherwise. He adjusted his cufflinks, his movements stiff, then brushed past them both without another word. When the door closed, silence stretched heavy between Richard and Clara. Her hands were trembling, though she clenched them into fists to hide it. She should have felt relief, gratitude. Instead, unease coiled in her chest. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. Richard turned to her, his expression still taut with anger. "Yes, I did." Clara shook her head. "Every time you defend me, it only proves their point, that I'm here because of you, that I can't stand on my own." He stepped closer, his voice firm. You stood on your own long before I ever stepped in. What happened just now? What you said to him that was all you... Don't diminish that. Her throat tightened. And yet, it still looks like I need saving. Richard's gaze softened, just barely. Let them think what they want. I know the truth. And so do you. Clara looked away, struggling to hold back the weight pressing against her chest. The truth. The truth was that the line between professional loyalty and something deeper had blurred so completely she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. And now, the entire company was circling, waiting for the chance to tear them apart. That evening, as Clara packed her bag to leave, she caught sight of Richard in his office through the glass wall. He stood at the window, staring out at the city, his hands clasped behind his back. The image struck her a man surrounded by power, yet isolated, burdened by battles no one else could see. And for the first time, she realized his anger wasn't just about her. It was about all the years he had been forced to fight alone. But this time, he wasn't alone. And whether she was ready or not, Clara knew the confrontation with Mark was only the beginning. The summons came without warning. A terse email. Emergency board meeting, 5 p.m. Attendance mandatory. Clara read it twice, her heart pounding. Emergency meetings weren't for minor issues, they were for crises. And deep down, she already knew what this one was about. When she entered the boardroom, her stomach clenched. The space was vast, lined with mahogany panels and crowned with a chandelier that glowed like judgment itself. Around the long, polished table sat the directors of Hale & Co., men and women whose signatures could change the company's future in a single vote. Mark Preston was already there, leaning smugly against his chair. Beside him sat Margaret Doyle from HR, her folder thick with documents. Their eyes flicked toward Clara as if she were the defendant in a courtroom. At the head of the table sat Richard Hale, posture rigid, expression unreadable. The chairman cleared his throat. Let's begin. Mr. Preston, you requested this hearing. Mark rose smoothly. A picture of false humility. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With respect, the integrity of this company is at stake. Over the past weeks, disturbing evidence has come to light regarding Mr. Hale's relationship with his assistant, Ms. Whitfield. Clara's pulse spiked. Mark held up a folder. Photographs of the two dining together after hours. Text messages suggesting ongoing personal involvement. And multiple reports from staff concerned about favoritism. Our HR department has confirmed these accounts. All eyes turned toward Margaret. She adjusted her glasses, her tone clinical. Our policies are clear. Zero tolerance for relationships between supervisors and subordinates. Allowing this to continue would expose the company to liability and reputational damage. The prudent course of action is to remove Ms. Whitfield immediately. The words sliced through Clara like glass. Remove, as though she were a weed to be pulled, an inconvenience to be discarded. She looked at Richard, but his face remained impassive, his hands folded tightly on the table. The chairman nodded gravely. Ms. Whitfield, you may respond. Clara's legs felt like stone as she rose. She wanted to disappear, to run, to hide. But something inside her, something fierce, born of exhaustion and truth, pushed her forward. I know what people think of me, she began, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. I know the rumors, that I'm just a secretary who caught the CEO's eye, that I took a shortcut to power. She paused, scanning the room. But that isn't who I am, and it isn't why I'm here. Murmurs rippled around the table. Clara straightened her shoulders. Mr. Hale chose me as his assistant not because of ambition, but because of something far simpler, humanity. He saw that I treated him as a man, not just a title. When others laughed, I noticed. When others schemed, I cared. That's all I've ever done my job, and my duty to treat people with decency. Her throat tightened, but she pressed on. If that makes me a liability, then maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe it's a culture that values suspicion over truth. The room fell silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the chandelier. Clara sank back into her chair, her heart hammering, her palms damp. She had said what she could. Whatever happened now was out of her hands. Then Richard stood. The room shifted as every eye turned toward him. He adjusted his jacket, his expression calm but unyielding. "I've listened to the accusations," he said evenly. "I've heard the whispers, the photographs, the gossip, and I won't deny the obvious Clara Whitfield matters to me." A stunned silence swept the room. Mark's smirk faltered. Margaret stiffened. Richard's voice deepened, firm with conviction. "She matters because she is everything this company claims to value: integrity, loyalty, humanity. While others play politics, she works. While others seek advantage, she seeks truth. That is why I chose her, and that is why I will continue to choose her." He looked directly at Mark, his eyes like steel. "You want me to distance myself from her to protect appearances, but I won't, because appearances built on lies mean nothing. I choose her. I choose us." The words hung heavy, reverberating through the boardroom like a verdict. The room erupted in murmurs, some shocked, some disapproving. The chairman rapped his gavel. "Order!" Mark sprang to his feet, his composure cracking. "This is outrageous! He's admitting favoritism in front of the board. He's risking everything for Enough," Richard cut in, his voice sharp as a blade. "What I risk is mine to decide. And what I build, I will protect, including the people who stand with me." Mark's face flushed red, but he said nothing more. Margaret cleared her throat, her professional mask slipping slightly. "Mr. Hale, this stance will expose us." "Then let it," Richard snapped. "I built this company from collapse once. I can do it again. But I will not sacrifice decency for the sake of optics." The chairman leaned back, his expression unreadable. "This is highly irregular. The board will need to deliberate." But the decision didn't matter in that moment, because for the first time, Richard had stripped away the mask, standing not as CEO, but as a man. And in front of the most powerful people in the company, he had chosen her. As the meeting adjourned, Clara gathered her notes with trembling hands. She felt exposed, raw, yet strangely unburdened. The truth was out. Whatever storm came next, at least she wasn't hiding anymore. Richard caught her eye as the directors filed out. His expression softened, almost imperceptibly, and in that fleeting glance, Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She wasn't sure if they had just saved themselves or doomed them both. The boardroom emptied slowly, its heavy doors closing one by one until only echoes remained. Clara lingered near the far wall, gathering the last of her notes with trembling fingers. The chandelier's glow seemed harsher now, reflecting off the polished wood like shards of glass. She felt exposed, as though every word she had spoken, every glance Richard had given her, still hung in the air, etched into the walls. The meeting hadn't ended with a resolution, only a fracture. Some directors had spoken in Richard's favor, their voices pragmatic, almost weary. "The company is profitable because of Hale. He delivers results. We'd be foolish to destabilize leadership over rumor." Others had been just as firm in opposition. "The optics are untenable. Investors won't tolerate scandal. We can't allow personal entanglements to dictate corporate decisions." The chairman had adjourned the meeting with vague promises of further review. But Clara knew what that meant. The war had only begun. She followed Richard back to his office in silence. His stride was measured, shoulders taut, but she could sense the storm inside him. When the door shut behind them, the city's skyline framed his silhouette, a man carrying the weight of an empire on his back. Clara set her notes on the desk, her voice quiet. "They won't let this go." Richard loosened his tie, exhaling sharply. "Of course they won't. Half of them see blood in the water. The other half are too cautious to take a stand. For now, they'll bide their time, wait for leverage. And Mark?" she asked. Richard's jaw tightened. "He'll use this as fuel. Men like him thrive on chaos, but let him try. I've faced worse. Clara moved closer, her chest heavy. I don't want you to fight because of me. His gaze snapped to hers, sharp and unyielding. This isn't just about you, Clara. It's about what they think they can control, about whether I let them dictate who I trust, who I choose. The pause lingered, waited, her breath caught, the unspoken word hovering just beyond reach. Clara turned toward the window, the city lights blurring through her unshed tears. I can't help wondering if I made it worse, if speaking up, standing there in front of all of them, only gave them more reason to see me as a threat. Richard stepped behind her, his voice low, steady. You made it better. You showed them courage. You reminded them what this company pretends to value but forgets to practice humanity. Her shoulders trembled. Humanity doesn't always survive in rooms like that. He placed a hand gently on her arm, grounding her. Neither does cowardice. And I'd rather go down fighting beside someone honest than win surrounded by liars. The words broke something in her, loosening the knot of fear lodged in her chest. She turned, and before she could think better of it, Richard's arms were around her. It wasn't a calculated gesture, not the careful reserve of a CEO managing appearances. It was raw, instinctive, a man clinging to the one person who saw him not as a machine, but as a man. Clara melted against him, her cheek pressed against his chest. She could feel the steady thrum of his heartbeat, the rise and fall of his breath. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel alone. Whatever happens, Richard murmured, his voice rough, we lose or win together. Clara closed her eyes, the words sinking deep into her bones. She wanted to believe them, to let herself rest in the promise. But part of her still trembled, knowing the world outside these walls was sharpening its knives. Later that night, after most of the building had emptied, Clara lingered at her desk. The halls were silent, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. She glanced once more toward Richard's office. His lamp still glowed, his figure still silhouetted against the glass. He hadn't left either. She thought of Margaret's cold eyes, Mark's smug grin, the board's divided voices. She thought of Richard's arms around her, the quiet conviction in his tone. The battle wasn't over. It might never be over, but at least now, they weren't pretending. 18 months later, the Hale Financial Tower gleamed brighter than ever against the Chicago skyline. The world outside had changed. The markets had weathered storms. The city had endured another brutal winter, but inside the company, change had been even more profound. Clara Whitfield stepped out of the elevator, onto the executive floor, her heels clicking against the polished marble. This time, heads didn't turn with suspicion or whispers. They turned with acknowledgement, even respect. On the glass door etched with her name, the letters gleamed, Clara Whitfield, Vice President of Operations. She still paused sometimes when she saw it, as if reminding herself it was real. The journey hadn't been easy. Every step had been earned through long nights, meticulous work, and the willingness to stand tall when others doubted her. But she had proven herself, not as someone's assistant, not as someone's roomer, but as a leader in her own right. Her office was larger now, with a view of the river that seemed to stretch endlessly, a reminder of how far she had come. The desk bore no clutter. Clara had learned to master chaos without letting it master her. A stack of reports awaited her signature, and her assistant, yes. She now had her own assistant popped in to confirm details for an afternoon meeting. But even amid the responsibilities, Clara felt something she hadn't before, steadiness. A sense that she belonged. When she walked into the boardroom now, she wasn't a defendant, she was a voice. And when she spoke, people listened. Richard entered her office just past noon, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He wore his usual charcoal suit, tie perfectly knotted, but his smile was softer now, less guarded. Thought you could use this? He said, setting one on her desk. Clara grinned. You remembered the hazelnut. 18 months of memorizing your calendar, your coffee, your flight preferences. Richard teased. And you think I'd forget. they shared a quiet laugh. It was still strange sometimes, this balance between their personal lives and their professional roles. But they had found a rhythm. At work, Richard was the CEO and Clara the vice president. Their interactions and meetings were crisp, professional, sometimes even combative when strategy demanded it. But outside the glass walls, when the day was done, they allowed themselves the honesty of being Richard and Clara, two people who had chosen each other despite everything. The transition hadn't been easy. There had been more battles with the board, more scrutiny from the press. Yet when they finally went public as a couple, months after the worst of the storm had passed, they did so without theatrics. A simple statement, a united front, no apologies. The world had adjusted, slowly, grudgingly, but it had. One of the most significant changes hadn't been their relationship, but the company itself. After the boardroom trial and the storm that followed, Richard had spearheaded a sweeping reform of policies this time, with Clara at his side, her fingerprints on every page. A new code of ethics was drafted, one that emphasized transparency, accountability, and protection for employees at every level. Clear guidelines were established for reporting misconduct, and safeguards were put in place to prevent retaliation. The most radical change came in the form of a new principle. No one, regardless of rank, was above scrutiny. Even the CEO. It was more than a policy, it was a promise. And though some grumbled, most embraced it. Because beneath the tension, everyone knew the truth. A healthier culture meant stronger results. Clara sipped her coffee, watching Richard as he scanned a briefing folder she'd left on her desk. Still reading my notes, she teased. Still impressed by them, he countered. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the kind of look that carried 18 months of battles, late nights, compromises, and victories. Clara leaned back, her voice soft. Do you ever regret it? Choosing me, choosing us. Richard set the folder down, his eyes steady, not for a single moment. Her chest tightened with quiet relief. He reached across the desk, brushing his fingers lightly against hers. We proved them wrong, Clara, not by hiding, not by apologizing, but by standing in the open. She smiled, a smile that carried both gratitude and resolve, and by changing the rules so no one else has to fight the way we did. That afternoon, Clara walked into the boardroom for the quarterly strategy session. As she took her seat near Richard, she caught sight of Mark Preston across the table. His position had been diminished. He was no longer the golden boy, no longer untouchable. The last year had exposed him for what he was, and though he still had a seat, it no longer carried the same power. Their eyes met briefly. Clara didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The truth had already spoken louder than any revenge could. When the meeting ended, Clara lingered by the window, watching the sun dip low over the river. Richard joined her, his hand brushing lightly against hers in a gesture that was both private and profound. This feels like the beginning of something, she said quietly. It is, he replied. The beginning we earned. Clara nodded, her heart full. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was leading, building, shaping a future not defined by fear, but by possibility. And she knew, whatever battles lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. The office lights had dimmed for the evening, leaving only the soft glow of the Chicago skyline bleeding through Clara's windows. She leaned back in her chair, hands resting on the polished wood of her desk, and allowed herself a moment of quiet. 18 months. The span of time seemed both impossibly short and endlessly long. She remembered that first night standing in the parking garage, helping Richard Hale toward his car while whispers swirled around them. She had been no one then, just an intern clinging to a fragile hope that her work would be enough to earn her a place. She had feared every misstep, counted every penny, and hidden her trembling hands whenever someone more powerful looked her way. Now, her nameplate read Vice President of Operations. She had earned it not through luck, nor through scandal, but through persistence. And yet, she knew it wasn't just about titles. It was about who she had become. Clara closed her eyes, remembering the faces of those who had tried to tear her down. Mark Preston with his mocking smirk, Margaret Doyle with her cold recitations of policy, even the board members who had questioned her very right to sit in the same room. Their voices had once shaken her, but somewhere along the line, she had stopped letting them define her. The truth was simple. She had learned to stand tall, not by becoming harder, but by refusing to lose her humanity. Richard had changed too. She thought of the man she had first seen at that party, a fortress in a tailored suit, his laughter rehearsed, his smile more performance than joy. He had been surrounded by people but utterly alone. Now, when he entered a room, his presence was still commanding, but the edges had softened. His laughter was no longer calculated. His eyes no longer scanned every corner searching for threats. He still carried the weight of leadership, but he carried it differently. Not as a shield, but as a responsibility. She had watched him learn to leave the office before midnight, to call his sister on Sundays, to linger over dinner without glancing at his phone every 5 minutes. She had watched him learn to live, and she knew, though he would never say it outright, that in choosing her, he had also chosen himself. That evening, Clara shut down her computer and gathered her things. Richard was waiting by the elevators, his tie loosened, his jacket draped casually over one arm. "Done for the day?" he asked. "For now." She smiled. I'll never be done. But I can pause." They walked out together, not in the hush of secrecy as before, but openly, with no fear of whispers. The staff in the lobby nodded respectfully as they passed. Some even smiled. Outside, the summer air was warm, the river reflecting streaks of orange and gold from the setting sun. Richard gestured toward the pedestrian bridge that stretched across the water. "Walk with me." She nodded. They moved in comfortable silence, the city buzzing faintly around them. Clara's heels clicked softly against the pavement, while Richard's longer strides matched her pace without thought. Halfway across the bridge, he stopped, setting his jacket aside and leaning against the railing. The wind tousled his dark hair, and for a moment, he looked less like a CEO and more like the man she had first glimpsed beneath the armor, a man searching for something real. He reached into his pocket, and her breath caught. No velvet box, no diamond sparkling under city lights, just a simple gold band resting in his palm. "Clara," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "I've spent most of my life chasing numbers, profits, margins, victories that looked impressive on paper, but felt empty in the quiet of my apartment. You changed that. You reminded me that winning isn't worth much if there's no one to share it with." Her eyes blurred, the river behind him shimmering as tears gathered. He held the band between his fingers, as if weighing its significance. "So, here I am. No boardroom, no audience, just the truth. Will you marry me?" For a heartbeat. Clara was 24 again, an intern clutching reports, terrified of being invisible and desperate not to fail. Then, just as quickly, she was the woman she had become, steady, strong, no longer afraid of the weight of her own voice. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, firmer. "Yes, Richard." He slipped the band onto her finger, his hand trembling slightly, and, for once, the man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals looked utterly unguarded. They didn't kiss immediately. Instead, they stood there in the warm glow of the sunset, side by side, hands joined, letting the enormity of the moment sink in. Clara laughed softly through her tears. "You didn't even plan a speech, did you?" "I planned plenty," Richard admitted. "But when I saw you standing here, none of it mattered. I just wanted to say the truth." "And you did," she said, squeezing his hand. They finally leaned into each other, not with the urgency of defiance or the secrecy of forbidden moments, but with the calm certainty of two people who had weathered storms and come out stronger. Later, as they walked back toward the city, Clara glanced down at the simple band catching the last rays of sun. It wasn't extravagant, but it was everything. It was a reminder of who she had been, who she had become, and who she would continue to be with Richard by her side, not as her rescuer, not as her boss, but as her partner. For the first time, she wasn't looking over her shoulder for whispers or sabotage. She was looking forward, toward a future she had helped build. The church was small, almost hidden between a row of maple trees on the outskirts of Evanston. It wasn't the kind of venue that appeared in glossy magazines or society pages. The pews were wooden, a little worn at the edges, and the stained glass windows caught the sunlight in quiet, uneven patterns. And yet, for Clara Whitfield and Richard Hale, it was perfect. The day began not with a flurry of planners or cameras, but with Clara's mother fussing over her hair in the modest bridal suite. Her father waited outside, practicing the steps he'd rehearsed in their kitchen the night before. The smell of lilies. Clara's favorite filled the air, arranged by her cousin and a few close friends. No paparazzi, no board members, no reporters waiting for scandal, just family, a few colleagues they trusted, and the soft hum of an old church organ warming up. Richard stood at the altar, not in a custom-tailored showpiece, but in a navy suit. Clara had once teased him for keeping too long. His tie was slightly crooked, and for once, he hadn't tried to fix it. He looked nervous, something no investor or competitor had ever managed to make him feel. When the doors opened and Clara stepped inside, the room seemed to hold its breath. Her dress was simple, ivory satin with lace at the sleeves, borrowed from her aunt's attic and altered by a neighborhood seamstress. She carried no diamonds, no embellishments, just a small bouquet of lilies tied with a ribbon. Her father's arm was steady as he walked her down the aisle, and when he placed her hand into Richard's, Clara saw his eyes glisten in a way she'd never forget. The ceremony itself was unadorned, no grand declarations, no choreographed gestures, just vows spoken quietly, words they had written themselves. Richard's voice trembled when he said, "You taught me that love is not a weakness, that it's the only thing that makes all of this." He gestured vaguely, as if encompassing the world outside those walls. Worth enduring. Clara's voice was steadier, though her heart raced. "You showed me that ambition without humanity is hollow. I choose you, Richard, today, tomorrow, and every day we have." When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was not theatrical, but tender in affirmation, a promise, a quiet victory that belonged to no one else. The reception was held in the churchyard under a tent strung with fairy lights. Instead of a 5-tiered confection, they had a simple cake from the bakery 2 blocks from Clara's childhood home. Instead of champagne towers, they poured sweet iced tea into mason jars. Children darted between tables, chasing bubbles. Clara's uncle manned the grill, flipping burgers with the seriousness of a professional chef. Richard's sister gave a toast that was equal parts embarrassing and touching, while Vivian Stone, now director of executive operations, raised her glass with a wry smile that carried genuine warmth. And then there was Lysander, Richard's oldest friend and occasional provocateur, who managed to bring half the room to tears and the other half to roaring laughter with his speech about the ruthless CEO who finally met his match in a woman from the wrong side of town. Richard laughed harder than anyone. Later, as dusk settled and the fireflies began to glow, Clara slipped off her heels and sat on the grass, her dress pooling around her. Richard joined her, jacket draped over one shoulder, the two of them watching the lanterns flicker in the trees. "This isn't how I imagined it," he admitted softly. "How did you imagine it?" she asked. He chuckled. "Something elaborate. Headlines. Maybe even fireworks over the river. The kind of spectacle CEOs are supposed to put on." And instead, he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Instead, it feels real. And that's all I want." Clara leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. For the first time in years, she felt no weight of expectation, no fear of whispers, no shadow of suspicion, just warmth, laughter, and the quiet hum of belonging. As the evening wound down, Clara stood to thank their guests. Her voice carried over the chatter, gentle but clear. "I know our story hasn't been easy. We've been called reckless, naive, even dangerous to the company we love. But we're here. Not because we ignored those voices, but because we chose to live honestly." She glanced at Richard, who met her gaze with quiet pride. "Love is not a liability. She continued, "It's the courage to be human in a world that fears vulnerability. And if there's one thing we hope people take from our journey, it's this: you don't have to choose between success and compassion. You don't have to trade humanity for power. You just have to be brave enough to live with both." Applause rippled across the yard, not thunderous, but heartfelt, rising from the people who had seen them struggle and endure. When the last lantern was extinguished and the final guests drifted home, Clara and Richard remained under the quiet canopy of trees. He touched her hand gently, the gold band on her finger glinting in the soft light. "What now?" she asked. He smiled. "Now we build, not just a company, not just a marriage, a life." And for once, neither of them felt the need to plan every detail. As the story of Clara Whitfield and Richard Hale closed its final chapter, it left behind more than titles or profits or policies. It left a question, one not just for them, but for everyone who had followed their journey. If you had to choose between your career and the love of your life, which would you choose? At its heart, this story reminds us that success without humanity is an empty victory. Richard Hale built an empire, yet it was only when he allowed himself to be vulnerable that he found true strength. Clara Whitfield entered as an overlooked secretary, yet her quiet integrity and compassion proved more powerful than any title or rumor. Life often tempts us to believe we must choose between career and love, between strength and kindness, between ambition and authenticity. But perhaps the real wisdom lies not in choosing one over the other, but in daring to live with both. For those of us who have weathered many seasons, the lesson feels clear. We are remembered not for the deals we closed or the positions we held, but for the humanity we carried into each moment. To love is not to lose power. It is to claim the courage to be fully alive. So, the next time you are asked to trade your heart for security, or your compassion for status, pause and ask yourself, which legacy would you rather leave behind? Thank you so much for spending your time with us today, listening to this story of love, courage, and humanity. If it touched your heart, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and uplift. Your support means the world to us, and it helps keep these stories alive. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and keep shining.